Welcome back. In this video, we'll be setting up our own custom hook. One of the main reasons that React introduced hooks to the ecosystem is that they allow you to craft your own reusable pieces of state and effect and other React-based logic. Once you start building your own custom hooks, the power of the new paradigm becomes a lot more clear. So let's create a hook around the functionality that can be reused between the joke and the stories component. So I'm going to put these two side by side so we can do a comparison. You'll notice that at the top lines, they pretty much share the same exact logic. They set up some state for the result of a fetch. So for the joke, that is for a resulting joke, and for the stories component, that is a resulting stories variable. Then the fetch actually occurs within an effect. So one goes to the official joke API, and then one goes to the news proxy server. In both instances, the result is to set the resulting JSON using the return setter method for the state. Pretty much the main difference is the URLs that are used for the fetch, as well as the initial values for the useState hook itself. So for the joke, it's an empty object. For the stories, it's an empty array. So we can definitely make a custom hook that extracts the duplicated logic. The trick is to make parameters out of the pieces that are unique to each component. So let's start with the joke.js file. I'm going to go ahead and close this second pane here on the stories.js. And up above, let's declare a custom hook called useFetch. So this is going to be a function called useFetch. This is going to have two parameters, which represent the unique things between the two components. One is the URL, and then the other is the initial value. At the top, we're going to place our useState hook. So go ahead and cut that from the joke, and then make that the first line of the useFetch hook. But instead of calling it joke, let's say that this is going to be the result of the fetch. Likewise, we're also going to say that the function, the setter, is setResult. Cool. Also, rather than hard coding an object as the initial value, we're going to pass in the initial value that we're getting as a parameter to the function itself. We're also going to extract the overall useEffect hook. So go ahead and extract it out and then place it within useFetch. Now we're going to refactor this to not use setJoke, but to use setResult. So instead of setJoke, we're going to set the result to that resulting JSON. And instead of going to the hard-coded URL, well, we're going to go to the URL that is passed in to the actual useFetch hook. Now I'm just temporarily pasting this outside so that way I don't use, or rather lose, that hard-coded URL. But indeed, we're going to fetch to the URL that is passed into useFetch rather than the hard-coded string. Finally, the key to this custom hook is that we return the main result at the end of this function. So right here at the end, we're going to return the result of the overall useFetch. Likewise, we can also take out that console.log and shorten this down to a line that only does a set result of the JSON. Nice. So now we can refactor the initial lines of the joke component itself. No longer does it have its own useState and useEffect hook that all lives within useFetch, so we need to call useFetch, and now we're going to pass in that hard-coded string at the URL for joke/random for the URL parameter, which is first, and the second parameter is the initial value, which at first is an empty object. The result is what is returned from the JSON, and we know that this result is the joke. So we'll say const joke equals that useFetch line. But notice that we're destructuring the setup and the punchline right after, so we can be a little more concise and destructure that from the result right away. Cool. All right, that completes the refactor. Now all of the functionality lives within the useFetch custom hook. It's going to set up the result for an initial value, then it'll fetch that, then set the result as the JSON, and then return it. Okay, if you don't have the application running already, head to the project directory in the command line and fire npm run start. Then visit the app at localhost 3000 in your browser, give it a refresh, and the result that you should find is that the joke still appears, which means the useFetch hook, the custom one, is working. Nice. Now, there's immediately some things that you can take away from this. First up, Notice that the custom useFetch hook was set up as a plain function. It takes in some input and then returns some output. Now, this works because it's consistent with the fact that the overall component itself is also a function. So you have the ability, really, to pull out any lines of the function component into a custom helper method that you like. That way it becomes pluggable within any other function component that you set up. This is why hooks are so powerful. They support a world of reusability with ease, where you can share logic between many React components to share the same React functionality. This kind of power was only achievable before with much messier techniques in the land before hooks, like creating custom wrappers and higher order components. These things often became quite a mess when you had to deal with multiple levels of wrappers within your component code. All right, now that we have this custom hook set up, let's apply it to our other component that has the same functionality in stories.js. But to make the code more easily reusable, let's place it within a designated location for custom hooks called hooks.js. So make a new file, hooks.js. Back in joke.js, cut the entire useFetch hook. So go ahead and cut it and then move it into hooks.js. At the top of this file, since this function is using useState and useEffect, you're going to need to import those hooks from the React library. So import useState as well as useEffect from the React library. Cool. And now for the actual function itself, we need to make sure that other files can still use it. So add an export keyword before the declaration of the function. Once you have that, head back to the joke.js file and then go ahead and import the useFetch hook from the new local ./hooks file. This also means we're no longer using useEffect and useState within this file, so you can delete those imports. Nice. And with the joke.js code cleaned up, we can also address the stories component. So once you have that changed, head to stories.js and then import useFetch. Make sure you spell import correctly, not incorrectly like me, and then get it from ./hooks. We're not going to be using useEffect or useState, or rather nor useState anymore, so delete those. And instead of these lines, well, we can grab the stories result by calling useFetch. We're going to pass in that entire hard-coded URL value, and the initial value for the stories array is an empty array. Very cool. You can go ahead and delete the useState and useEffect lines, and now the overall stories code, it's much more short and concise. All right. With that done, again, revisit the application in your browser and make sure the refactor went well. If you refresh, well, you should find that the application is consistent with what you had before, a joke and a stories list. Cool. So that's it. We've completed the custom useFetch hook. Now, before we move on, let's take a moment to look back at the hook we just made and examine a couple things. So one thing about this is that it's atypical of a JavaScript function. It seems to return the result of an asynchronous function directly. The inner fetch as a JavaScript function is the one that is asynchronous, meaning it's a function which doesn't return a value immediately. Instead, it's queued in the background, and its return value is handled at a later time by firing the callback in the final .then handler. So the odd thing about this function is that it seems to return the result directly in its last line, as if it already had the result from the fetch, despite the fact that this fetch function is asynchronous. That's definitely not normal for JavaScript, since JavaScript is non-blocking. It's not like JavaScript would wait for the result of the fetch before it got to that return value. So what's going on? Well, to arrive at the answer, we're going to use some already known information. Recall with the initial exploration of having a useState and useEffect work together that there was that initial danger of entering an infinite loop. For example, you could set up a useEffect hook with a callback that calls setState. This setup is prone to cause an infinite loop. When the effects callback fires, the setter from the useState causes a re-render. Now, the useEffect hook runs on every render. So the useEffect hook would once again call setState. The setState triggers a re-render again, which calls useEffect once more, which calls setState, which triggers a re-render, and so on and so forth. So there's this endless loop scenario. Luckily, we prevent this loop by providing an array as the second argument to useEffect. This array allows us to limit when React will refire the useEffect hook functionality. Based on the values in this array, React will know to only refire the hook when those values have changed, but with an empty array, you essentially tell React that it should never refire the useEffect hook. It should only execute the inner effect callback after the initial render. So how does this overall relate to the initial question about the useFetch hook? Why is it that an asynchronous JavaScript function is seemingly able to return its value in one overall function? All of that previous coverage about how the useEffect hook works with renders was to show you that it actually takes multiple fires of this custom hook before it actually returns the resulting data. Under the hood, it goes like this when you call the useFetch hook in a component. First, the useState line is crossed. This sets the result to the initial value within the internal React engine. Then, the useEffect hook is executed. It sends its callback to the React engine. It gets fired, and an asynchronous fetch is done to get data from an API. This is asynchronous though, and does not block JavaScript from executing the rest of the custom useFetch hook, so it gets to the final line. And in the first render, the result is returned as a value. Eventually though, the asynchronous functionality is completed. It gets to its final .then handler and fires its callback. In the callback, it sets the result to the JSON. Therefore, in the React engine, the result is changed from the initial value to the JSON. Another result of calling the setter function from the useState hook is that it re-triggers a render. And now once again, JavaScript re-evaluates this overall useFetch function within the component. Again, we're back to that first useState hook. This time, the result is destructured as the inner JSON value. Next, we arrive at the useEffect hook. But React sees that this useEffect hook has an empty array as its second parameter. Therefore, it's not keeping track of any values to know when to refire the hook if those values have changed between renders. Therefore, it knows to skip past the block. Finally, JavaScript gets to the last line of the hook. And the result this time is returned as the JSON. After all, that's what's stored in the inner React engine. So overall, it may seem like the useFetch hook has the ability to return the result of the asynchronous fetch by only running once. But in reality, React is actually executing the custom hook twice across two renders. In the first render, the result of the hook is the initial value. When the fetch completes, the callback with the setter is fired. This both sets the results to the JSON in the React engine and re-triggers a render. And on that second render, the result in this hook is returned as the inner JSON that is now stored. All right, overall, nice work on setting up that custom hook. So far, the main focus of the course has been figuring out what hooks are, meaning what they look like, their syntax, and how to write code with them. But given this discussion on the useFetch hook, we're starting to enter into that second question of how they really work under the hood. So let's commit to exploring this much more thoroughly by doing an investigation of how hooks really work under the hood in the next section. Before we do that though, there's going to be a final video in this initial section on discussing the subtle difference between the function keyword when making functions and arrow functions, since there are these two approaches to creating functions being used in our code overall. And I think it's important to understand the motivations behind this. All right, see you in the next one. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to head to the full course at udemy.com/reacthooks tutorial. Since you're coming from YouTube, I'm giving you access to the course at the max discount Udemy lets me create. I've posted details in the video description, and be sure to visit my website at davidtkatz.com as well, where you can find links to connect with me. All right, see you in the next one.